Righty. Well, there's Rocky. There he is. He's quite the cat. Hello, Rocky. You're quite the cat. You are. There he is. He's quite the cat. You're quite the cat. Hey, hey, you. Hi. He's a good boy. He is. He's a really good boy. You're a good boy, Rocky. You are. Ooh. Oh, my goodness. Hey, it's good to see you. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm coming to you from Camp Crazy today with my best friend Rocky the cat. And I'm going to tell you all a story. And I'm going to tell you all how, looking back over my life, I can see how things ended up as they are now. And I do have some regrets, and I'm going to tell you what they are. Ways that I could have done things differently and should have done things differently, but didn't do things differently. And now I'm kind of paying a price for that. But anyway, yeah. To start with, I think it needs to be understood that I lived in a small town, and it was a town. It was an old money town, and I wasn't an old money person though. So in the town where I grew up in Perth, Ontario, Canada, there's a clear division between the rich and the poor. And if you're poor, you're supposed to know your place. And you're supposed to accept that the wealthy people have a right to demand whatever they demand of you and not to question it. Now, I rebelled against that, and I don't regret that. Rebelling against that is not one of my regrets, even though it did cost me in some ways. But I will tell you where my regrets do lie. And my regrets lie in priorities. In many cases, I had the wrong priorities. Um, in many cases, I really did have the wrong priorities. And I'll explain that as I go on here a bit. Okay, when I was young, I was labeled, you can see my breath. It's cold. It's cold in here. Anyway, when I was young, I was labeled mentally retarded. And I was regarded as a simpleton and so on, and as a mental case. And these were labels that were hung on me. And they were used to justify some abusive things that were done to me. In those days, if you were labeled retarded, then your life really wasn't worth much. And so the medical profession or anyone else in power, they could pretty much do as they pleased with you. And I was used as a guinea pig for medical experiments. I talk about that in some other videos. Back in 1976, when I was 8 years old, I believe the labels were hung on me for that reason. Of course, having these experiences caused me to see the world in a different way. It caused me to see authority figures not as heroes and as above reproach, but as people to be challenged and questioned, and also as people who could be quite corrupt and weren't to just be unconditionally trusted. I guess in some respects I was ahead of my time. Getting his whiskers in my mouth, that's why I keep having to move my head here. Anyway, in some respects I was ahead of my time, I guess. Rocky gets the best head boobs. One regret I don't have is I don't regret bringing Rocky home. I'm glad that Rocky is with me. I was very resistant to taking a cat. When my friends were trying to get me to take a kitten, I was very resistant to it. But I'm happy that I did. Anyway, it's been one of the best things I've ever done in my life is to have Rocky here with me. Or wherever I've been. I've been a few different places with Rocky. Anyway, when I was in the hospital in Toronto being used as a guinea pig for medical experiments, I got sexually molested by an orderly. I do tell that story in some other videos. Anyway, so basically I was, on several occasions, I was, had things done to me by a man. So I had some homosexual activity imposed on me against my will. That affected me in a way that I didn't even know at the time. And I think it does for anybody that happens to. You kind of question, because you're being used that way by another man, you kind of question your own masculinity. You know, it causes that to happen. Yeah, I never questioned my sexuality. I knew I was straight, but I questioned my role, you could say, or whatever, that I could be used that way by another male. Even though that male was an adult and I was a child, and that male was in a position of authority over me, and it was an abuse, it shouldn't have happened. And I know all that intellectually, but emotionally I felt like I had something to prove. And then, of course, because I was different, because I was a nonconformist, and because I was poor and living in an old money town where I was expected to conform to certain things that were considered normal, and I wasn't conforming to those things. For example, I always drove old cars that I could buy for very little money, because the way I looked at it is an old car is better than no car. Plus, I actually liked old cars, and I still do. I would much sooner drive a 1940s or 50s or 60s car than I would a modern car. I really would. If I had a choice between a fully restored 1947 Dodge, I had a 1947 Dodge at one time, that's why I'm using that example. If I had a choice between owning a fully restored 1947 Dodge, something that was reliable because it was fully restored, so it was like new, but was still an old car, you know, with all the attributes of an old car, or owning a brand new 2025 Cadillac or whatever, I would take the fully restored 1947 Dodge any day. But in the 1980s, these old cars were seen as undesirable, and people would laugh at you for owning them. And so, and a lot of people would say, well, it's better to walk than to have something like that. So that's the reason I could buy them up so cheaply, is because, Rocky, is because, there he goes. Look at him go away. He's still pretty strong, you know. He's 84 years old in human years, because he's 17 in chronological years. So that's 84 in cat years, I guess, or whatever, or in human years. Anyway, and I, you know, it was seen as an embarrassment to the town. And then, of course, I was harassed by the police because of that. And the local police were really corrupt, and I was harassed by them. And, you know, I knew that I was not in the wrong, though, so I stood up. And again, I don't regret that either, because that was abuse of authority, and I think it was right to stand up. But I'm coming to the stuff I regret. What I do regret is that I think because of having been molested, and then also because of not being taken seriously, not being seen as an adult even when I was an adult, and so on, by my compatriots and by the people of the town, being perceived to be the village idiot, basically, because I didn't put on an appearance that people expected, and because I had an unconventional way of looking at the world, and because I didn't blindly trust and blindly obey authority. And because, and like I say, all of that, I was not taken seriously by females. I wasn't considered a desirable prospect, basically. The ladies were not, beating a path to my door. I'll tell you that. In fact, if anything, they were running away from me. They wanted nothing to do with me. And then I did have some involvement with a girl when I was in my about 21, I guess. And that ended badly. And then she falsely accused me of raping her, and that went around town. So now I was labeled a rapist. On top of that, people in town were spreading rumors that I was a homosexual, and so on. So then I felt a need to prove I wasn't that. And so I was labeled a rapist and a homosexual, basically, in the town. And then that homosexual label transformed into a pedophile label. People said I was a pedophile, which again wasn't true. I was actually quite straight. I was interested in adult women. The trouble is, adult women weren't interested in me. But I still didn't turn to men, had no interest in men, and I didn't turn to children because I had no interest in children. And the way I was watched by the police in that town, because they were determined to put me in jail, I had one cop in that town even tell me that it was a career goal of his to see me in the penitentiary. He wanted to put me in the penitentiary before he retired. He told me that. Well, because of that, if I had been a pedophile, I would have got caught because I didn't get away with anything. If I let my license plate lapse by a couple of days, didn't renew it on time and let it lapse, I'd be pulled over. I mean, it was that. Like, they watched me continuously, and they just hoped that they could get something on me. And so if I had been, doing perverted things to children, I would have got caught. I would have got caught real quick. And any crime I committed, I'd have got caught at, and really quickly. As it stands, I was accused of things I didn't do. I was blamed for things I didn't do. I had my name added to the list of suspects so many times for things that I didn't do, in some cases for crimes that never even occurred. They'd actually make up crimes and say something happened and then confront me with it. And try to get me to agree that it did happen and that I was the perpetrator. That's how bad it was. Anyway, all of that also meant that I was not desirable to women. Like, women like a bad boy, but they don't like a bad boy in that context. They don't like somebody who's labeled a pedophile and all the rest of it, and a rapist and so on. And so what happened was I was unable to be with a woman. I wanted to be with a woman, but I was unable to be with a woman because, you can't force a woman to be with you, and I wouldn't anyway, even if I could. But what happened was they wanted nothing to do with me because there was a stigma attached to me. And even the ones who didn't really believe the stories, even the ones who knew that I wasn't a pedophile, or at least they didn't believe I was, and that I wasn't a rapist, or they didn't believe I was, even those women didn't want anything to do with me because there was such a stigma attached to being connected with me. And then on top of that, because I was perceived as being weak in my mind and so on, and in my body, I was targeted by bullies. And I was getting jumped on the street a lot. I was getting beat up. And so I started arming myself and I started fighting back. And I come to the conclusion that if I was crazier than the guy that was coming after me, that would cause him to back off. And if I was prepared to do worse to him than he was doing to me, that would cause him to back off. And that did work, because predators tend to be cowardly. But of course, again, that enhanced my reputation as a mental case. That enhanced my reputation as a bad guy in the town, and as a dangerous person, when really I was only a danger to those who posed a danger to me. But still, I was seen as a dangerous person. I think Rocky just peed on my floor again. Darn it all, anyway. I'll have to check in a few minutes and see. Anyway, when I'm finished the video, I'll have a look. All of that to say, though, I was not a desirable person for women. I was poor. My health was bad because of having been used as a guinea pig in 1976 when I was 8 years old. I never really recovered from that. So I had some health problems. I was poor. I was labeled mentally retarded. I was labeled mentally ill. I was labeled a pedophile and a rapist. None of this is good stuff to have on your resume. And so I was not desirable to women. Now, the girl who falsely accused me of rape, I found out later that her father had repeatedly molested her when she was a little girl, and it was bad anyway. So she was all screwed up in her head, herself. And I wasn't the only one. There was other guys that she made the same accusation against. And it seemed what it was is, if you got close to her, like if you got to have feelings for her beyond lust, where you actually started to love her and think there might be some future with her, then she'd get out of the relationship very quickly, and she'd start making these kinds of accusations. And that was her way, I guess, of pushing men away, Now, since then, she's gotten married and everything, so obviously she's recovered quite a bit from that, but that was the reason that had happened anyway, because she wasn't in her right mind at the time. And anyway, there was no rape, it didn't happen, but still, that was the accusation I was facing back in the day. It ended up anyway that and again, if it could be proven that there was, I'd have been sent to prison, because the police were looking for any reason to send me to prison. And again, you get sent to prison with those kinds of charges, the other criminals will take care of you. There's a good chance you won't be coming out of there alive. So that would be desirable for the police, to get the other prisoners to take care of me, to do their dirty work for them, basically, to get me out of the way, get me out of circulation permanently. Anyway, my regrets, though, a lot of my regrets do have to do with women. I pursued relationships with women constantly, to no avail. I pursued relationships with women who, in many cases, weren't very good women. Weren't women that you really could have a future with, because they were badly screwed up themselves. And I knew a lot of women who were profoundly screwed up, and I pursued relationships with quite a few of them, and it was bad. It was really bad. I wasted a lot of time pursuing relationships, partially because I was trying to prove that I wasn't what I was labeled. I was trying to prove I wasn't a homosexual or a pedophile, and I was trying to prove that I was desirable, and so on. And the more I tried to prove that, the more I was getting the opposite result, And I wasted a lot of time and energy on that. And then, of course, when everything would fall through, which it would, I'd go into a depression. And then I would be kind of useless for 6 months or a year. I'd be totally without any ambition, because I'd just go into a depression over it. And so what happened was, in my prime years, which were still hard for me because my health wasn't good. I wasn't healthy like a man in his 30s should be. I wasn't. But still, in my prime years when I could have been earning and so on, I wasn't, because of my health partially, and also because of all this continuously pursuing women, which was bad. It didn't work out. And I look back now, and when I was young, you could buy a nice piece of land around here for $5,000. That same piece of land now is $250,000. I wish now that I had just applied myself to earning money. I wish that I had realized that I am as good as I am at this property maintenance thing. I wish I had known that back then, and maybe I would have known if I hadn't been so focused on women and on sex and so on, and basically on trying to get laid to prove I was a man, and also in trying to get into a relationship with a woman to prove that I was a man, and to prove that I wasn't gay and I wasn't a pedophile, and that a woman would be with me, And I wish now that I had just focused on earning, and that I had bought a piece of land back in the day when land was so cheap around here. I really wish I had done that now, but I didn't. And so here I am in a situation where I'm living in a field in a camper on a friend's property just by the good graces of his family. And, financially destitute. I'm constantly worried about money and worried about what's going to become of me when I get older, to the point where I can't do anything. And unable to save money, really, partially because I'm deep in debt from trying to heat a house that I rented from somebody I shouldn't have trusted. And partially because everything is very expensive. It costs every cent that I bring in just to eat and to keep this place heated to a minimum. And you can see my breath. And I have the heat on. I have the heater going, but just to heat it to a minimum so we don't freeze to death in here, it costs me everything, pretty much, that and eating and putting gasoline in my truck and keeping my truck on the road and so on. And so I don't have extra money to save, and I'm not the only one in that predicament. That's a common thing right across the country, is people don't have extra money that they can save. And even if you save it, I'm 57. By the time I could afford to buy a $250,000 piece of property, I'll already be dead for 20 years. It would take 50 years to save enough money to do that. And by that time, that $250,000 piece of property is going to be a $1 million piece of property. That's if Jesus don't come back before then, which I have a feeling he's coming back very soon. I have a feeling we're in the season. I may be wrong, but that's what I think. Anyway, my biggest regret in all of it is that I spent so much time focused on women where there was no future for me, and focused on proving something through women, focused on proving that I was in fact normal and straight like every other man, and basically proving that to idiots, the people who were just gossips and ne'er-do-wells and mean-spirited, nasty type people in the little town where I lived. People who would sit around the beer parlor and gossip about anybody who wasn't there. Those types of people. And here I was trying to prove something to those idiots when I should have been out there building a future for myself as best I could. And so, yeah, I regret that anyway. I wasted too much time on that, on women, on pursuing relationships with women, and also pursuing relationships with women, many of whom weren't very good women. Really, a lot of them were not. A lot of them were badly screwed up themselves. And so, like I say, I regret that anyway. Um, I wish now that I had done the things that I wish now I had recognized that I had the abilities I do have when I was younger, so I could have had more years of pursuing that and maybe built some sort of a business. I wish that I had bought some land when land was still cheap. Like $5,000, of course, was a lot of money to me when I was impoverished, but it wasn't out of reach. I could theoretically have saved that money back in those days and bought um, a piece of land, and I wish I had have done that, but I didn't. So now it's just too expensive. So, and I wish that I hadn't have allowed myself to go into that cycle of pursuing women and then having that backfire on me and then going into a depression over it and then coming out of that and going and pursuing some other woman, you know, going through that cycle for so many years. And of course, too, you got to bear in mind when you're in your 20s and 30s, the sex drive is very strong. And so I was continuously sexually frustrated. And that's on top of feeling the need to prove something. You know, like I say, to people who I really shouldn't have felt the need to prove anything to. So, like I say, I wish that I had had the discernment that I have now when I was young. And I wish, my eyes are burning. I wish I had had the discernment I had when I was young. My goodness. Sometimes that heater puts out fumes that cause my eyes to burn. But I wish I had the discernment that I had when I was young that I have now. And I wish that I had been better at putting aside any inclination to be dealing with women in that way. I wish that I hadn't allowed um, my frustration, my sexual frustration, and also my, my desire to prove that I was, in fact, an adult and a man, to interfere with my life the way it did. You know, I allowed that to happen. That's on me. That's my fault. I wish I hadn't have done that, and I wish that I had had more foresight. I wish I had seen where things were headed, because, like I say, if I had started buying land back when it was still relatively cheap, especially if I had to recognize that I have the abilities I have when it comes, because I'm very detail oriented and stuff, and so I can do beautiful work on a property. I can take a property that's all overgrown and with trash all over it and everything else, and I can turn that into a really nice place. And I'm really good at it. And I wish I had recognized that when I was young, that I had that ability, and I wish I had pursued that. And I wish that I had then taken that money and invested it in land. I really do. Because I would have, today, I would have a small fortune. And my future would be secured. I wouldn't be in an old camper with water leaking and the pillows freezing to the walls, which is happening, and mold, black mold and everything else, and hoping that the big buddy heater doesn't asphyxiate me in my sleep and all that. I really wish that I've started to run it all night now because I can't stand the cold anymore. I get sick. The cold air actually gets into my lungs and makes me sick if I try overnight to shut it down overnight. So I've just been running it all the time now so I don't get sick again. I got sick earlier in the winter because I was shutting it down. But the thing is, I really wish that I had had different priorities when I was young. I do. I wish that I had done things differently. I wish I had different priorities. And like I say, I wish that relationships with females weren't as big on my list of priorities as they were. And I mean, also, I wish that my motivation for wanting to get into those relationships was different. Because as it stands, my motivation really had more to do with proving something to others than anything. Because I was labeled that I wasn't a man. I was labeled that I was a child because I was considered to be mentally deficient. And I was also labeled to be an effeminate. They labeled me a homosexual. And so neither of those things was true, but that's how I was labeled. And so, as a result of that, I felt the need. I felt like if I could just get into a relationship with a woman, I could prove that I'm an adult and that I am not an effeminate, that I'm not a homosexual, that I'm just a normal man. But I spent too much time and energy on that. And now all that time is gone. The world has changed, and it now costs $1 gazillion to buy anything, and I don't have the earning ability that I would have had years back. And it's costing so much money just to stay alive that, like I say, I don't know. Would have been better had I went down a different path, that's all. Anyway, that's it. Those are some of my regrets, and maybe some younger people, if they watch this, are facing similar things. It's a different world today, for sure. Basically, I guess my advice to a young man would be don't waste too much time pursuing pussy. Don't waste too much time pursuing that. Work on yourself, work on achieving some financial independence. You want to be as independent from the system as you can be, because the system does not care about you, and the system is actually out to get you, especially if you live in Canada. We have a system right now that will offer to kill you rather than to give you any medical treatment if you get sick. It's a dangerous thing to go into a hospital in Canada right now, because they might kill you and just pretend that you died just because you died. They might kill you and harvest your organs and sell them. That's the shit we deal with here in this country. That's how bad things are here. And it's getting worse all the time. So the young people now actually have a worse time of it than the young people did when I was young. But even when I was young, the system didn't care about you. And there was still a lot of corruption and stuff. But at least it was easier to earn money, and money went further. You could actually do something with your money. The young people now have a much, much worse time of it, I think, than people did when I was young. And even I managed, with the opportunities that I did have, to piss it all away. So, if you're a young man now, you got to work even harder, and you got to be even more focused, because you can piss it all away even easier than I did. I had to kind of apply myself to pissing it all away. But you can piss it all away nowadays without even trying, Now, I didn't know I was trying to piss it all away at the time, but I really was. Without realizing what I was doing, I was pissing it all away. But, nowadays, like I say, you've got an even bigger battle to fight than I had. And I didn't fight the battle properly, and that's how I got into the mess I'm in. But, piece of land don't cost $5,000 anymore. and the work isn't there. People are working part-time, two or three part-time jobs just to rent a room somewhere, or just to live in the in their parents' basement. You know, it's craziness. But even so, figure out what you can do and do that. If you can get into some side hustle, if you're really good at something, then pursue that. And don't worry about relationships with women or whatever. If that's meant to happen, it'll happen. If it isn't, well, then it isn't. But you just focus on yourself and getting yourself into a good position. And then be very careful, because once you get into a good position, you may get involved with a woman, but she may be the wrong sort of woman. So you got to have some discernment there too, to realize not all women are good, not all women have good intentions, and they're dealing with their own demons. Just like we deal with ours, they deal with theirs too. And some of them are badly screwed up, and some of them will fuck you over badly. They say divorce is the fucking you take for the fucking you got. And there is truth in that too. I know a guy in Perth. He's a friend of mine, actually. And he was telling me about a friend of his. And this fellow actually had done things properly. He was a young guy, and he had worked hard, and he had managed to buy a house, and he owned the house outright. He had paid the house off. And I guess he liked his toys, though. He liked his four-wheelers and his snowmobiles and all the rest of it. And so he had all that stuff. He had this girlfriend. She moved into his house with him. She stayed for a month, but claimed she had stayed for 6 months. I think 6 months was the minimum amount of time she had to be there before she could take everything from him. But she stayed for a month. And then she left, said she'd been there for 6 months. He couldn't prove she hadn't been there for 6 months. And he was forced to sell his house and all his stuff and give her half the money. So there's a guy who did everything right. But then he made one mistake, and it set him right back to square one. He's got to start over now. Because he fought with the wrong head, if you know what I mean. He didn't use the brains up here. He was thinking with the other head, And he got a little sex out of it. And he got in a relationship that lasted about a month. And it cost him half of everything he owned. And so there you go. See, that's what happens. One lapse. Even if you've done everything right, you have one lapse of judgment in a relationship. And you can be put right back to square one. Now, he was still a young man when that happened, so of course he could rebuild, but what a kick in the pants. I'll bet you he was a lot more careful after that, though, about who he got involved with and how quickly he moved, too, not to be too quick to move somebody in with him and so on, I'll bet you that was a hard lesson that he learned, and hopefully he did learn it, So like I say, you got to be careful. It's a tough world. And, just because you think you're in love or whatever, you still got to be very careful. Move slowly. Don't get too quick to be involved in things. Don't move too quickly. Basically, whether you're a man or a woman, make the other person prove themselves before you get in too deep with them. Because women get screwed over too. It isn't just men. Women can also be screwed over. And there are men that will screw a woman over badly too. Now, my advice is more geared toward young men because I'm a man and I understand the struggle of being a man. I don't really understand the struggle of being a woman. There may be some things that are commonalities between the two, but there's also things that are different. And Like I say, my experiences with women, for the most part, have not been great. And that was partially because the women were shitty, and it was partially because I was shitty. But, so it's also partially my own fault that proved to be the case. But what I have learned from that is you got to be very careful. Things aren't always what they seem to be. And, yeah, you can get badly screwed over. And I mean, like I say, it can happen if you're a woman too. It's just a different perspective that I don't quite understand with women. So that's why I'm gearing what I'm saying more towards young men, because I was a young man. I've never been a young woman, so I don't know about being a young woman. But anyway, I'm sure some of these things that I'm saying can be applied either way, though. I'm sure that a young woman listening to this can apply at least some of what I'm saying. But I'm just not sure what parts of what I'm saying she can apply, and that's why I'm not trying too hard to pass on anything to a young woman, because I don't know what's of value to a young woman and what I'm saying and what isn't. But I do know what's of value to a young man, having been a young man and having made the mistakes I made. Anyway, that's it. That's all I can say about it. Don't get into a relationship to prove something, or don't try to get into a relationship to prove something. Don't worry too much about what idiots think. Even if they do think that you're this and that and the other thing, which isn't very nice. You know, basically screw them. Don't worry about it. Just focus on yourself and keep moving forward, and do the things you need to do to secure your future. Otherwise, when you're 57 years old, you're going to be laying in bed freezing, where your breath can be seen, in a rundown, 50-year-old camper, um, with a dying cat beside you, who's your best friend, and you're going to be, Rocky's really the best part of this whole thing, by the way. But you're going to be wondering, what if I live into my 70s? What am I going to do then? Where am I going to end up? Am I going to freeze to death on a piece of pavement? Am I going to literally freeze to death laying on a piece of cardboard behind a dumpster in an alley somewhere? Because I do wonder that about me, if that's how it's all going to end for me. That's a pretty heavy thing. And that is an entirely valid possibility in my case. That may very well happen. So if you're 25 or 30 years old or 35 years old and you're listening to this, like I say, just do whatever you need to do to get yourself into a position where you're not going to be 57 and asking yourself, am I going to freeze to death on a piece of cardboard behind a dumpster somewhere when I'm 72 years old? Don't ever get yourself into that position where you're asking yourself that question, because that's a question I ask myself, because I mismanaged things, because I pursued things that I shouldn't have pursued. And in the meantime, while I was devoting my time and energy to that, I wasn't pursuing things I should have pursued. And here I am. Take a good look. Here I am. Don't be where I'm at. Not if you can help it. And believe it or not, your 50s comes very quickly. And I know people in their 80s who tell me your 80s comes very quickly too. And I have no reason not to believe them. All right, that's it. We'll see you later.